Wyoming Territory, 1879. The snow had not stopped for 3 days, and by the fourth, she had lost both the baby and her voice. Nella Hart stood barefoot in the middle of a cabin that was not hers anymore, the fire long gone out, her dress soaked to the knees. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her belly like she could still feel the warmth of her child there. But the cradle was empty. The silence in her throat matched the silence in the room. He had taken the baby. The man she had trusted. The man who had promised a life out west, who had built the cabin with her in the spring, who had smiled while picking out names. He was gone now with her son, and something inside her had snapped apart so hard that her voice broke with it. She could not scream, could not call out. She tried for days, but nothing came. She had walked 2 miles barefoot in snow to get to the trail. She did not know where she was going, just that she could not stay in that cabin. Not with the silence. Not with the cradle. She collapsed face first into the snow before dusk. When Luther Vale found her, she was curled like a paper scrap in the middle of the trail, her skin blue at the tips. He had been hauling fence wire back from town in his wagon and nearly missed her in the whiteout. She did not move when he approached, but her eyes were open and staring. "Hey," he said low, kneeling in the snow beside her. "Ma'am, you hear me?" She blinked once. "You hurt." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Luther looked at her feet red and raw beneath the hem of her dress. Her lips were cracked. She had not eaten in days. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her before lifting her into the wagon, careful not to jostle her too much. "You don't gotta talk," he said gently, tucking the coat tighter around her. "Just stay." She did not speak that night or the next. She sat by his fire wrapped in a quilt, staring at the flames like they were telling her something. Luther made stew and left a bowl near her. She ate slow like it hurt to chew, but she ate. He did not ask questions. Not yet. She watched him while he worked mending tack, feeding his horse, splitting wood. He was younger than she first thought, maybe 30, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled behind his ears and eyes the color of burnt wood. He moved like someone who had worked alone a long time. By the third night, she handed him a scrap of paper. Her writing was shaky. "Baby gone. Took him. Cannot speak." He read it, didn't look at her right away. Just folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. "You got a name?" he asked softly. She nodded once. "Nella," she mouthed. "Well," he said, voice rough, "you are safe here, Nella. You do not have to be afraid. I will help you find him." She looked down, her hands clenched together in her lap. "I mean it," he said. "You are not alone now." The next day, Luther hitched the wagon. "I am going into town," he told her. "Someone might have seen something. I will not be gone long." She followed him out the door, then stopped. She pointed to herself. "You want to come?" he asked. Her head bobbed once. He helped her up onto the wagon seat and wrapped a blanket around her legs. She did not speak, but she looked steadier somehow, like she had taken one step back toward herself. The town was small, just a post office, a general store, and a saloon. Luther went to the sheriff first. "Woman's child was taken," he said, keeping his voice low. "She cannot talk yet. Man who took him tall, dark coat, black horse. Might have come through here 5 days ago." The sheriff scratched his chin. "Might be the man who passed through Sunday. Said he had a new baby. Bought milk and left east." "East?" Luther asked. "Toward Rollins." Luther looked toward the wagon, where Nella sat staring straight ahead. "Thank you," he said. That night, Luther lit the fire again and poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Nella and sat across from her. "You do not have to tell me everything," he said. "But if you want to write it down, I will read it." She stared at the fire for a long time. Then she reached for the paper. His name was Eli. Said he wanted a new life. I followed him out here. Our son is named Walter. He is only 7 months old. Luther set the paper down. His jaw tightened. We will find him. She blinked fast. Her lips pressed together. She reached out, fingers brushing lightly against his. His hand turned over and held hers. I will not let anything happen to you now, he said. The next morning they set out early. Luther drove the wagon east, eyes sharp on the road. Nella sat beside him, wrapped in a thick shawl, her hands clenched in her lap. Her voice still had not returned, but she watched everything now: trees, hills, passing wagons. Her silence was no longer hollow. It was focused. They stopped at every post, every campfire, every trading station. Nella showed the note she had written, and Luther asked questions. At a way station near the Sweetwater River, a woman remembered a man with a black horse and a screaming baby. Did not look like no father to me, she said. Baby had red hair. Man was dark all over. Baby cried all night. Nella's breath caught. Her shoulders trembled. Luther wrapped an arm around her. That is him, he said. They reached Rawlins by dusk 3 days later. The town was bigger than the last rail lines, telegraph wires, more saloons than they needed. Luther left Nella in the room he rented above the livery and went out asking. When he came back, she was standing by the window, arms crossed tight. I found him, he said. Her eyes widened. He is working 3 miles east at a logging camp. Told them the child was his. Said the mother died. Something broke in her face. She stepped forward, fists clenched. I am going in the morning, Luther said. You do not have to come. She shook her head hard, then pointed to herself. You sure? She nodded once. All right, he said. We go together. It was barely light when they reached the camp. Luther tied the horse behind a thicket and turned to her. You wait here. If he runs, I will stop him. You just get to the boy. She nodded. He stepped into the clearing, walking straight into the middle of the camp. Men turned to look. One of them, tall, with a dark coat and a trimmed beard, stood up from the fire. You Eli? Luther asked. The man narrowed his eyes. Who is asking? You got a child that is not yours. Eli's hand dropped to the knife on his belt. You do not know what you are talking about. I do. The mother is here, and she wants him back. Eli turned, eyes darting toward the tent behind him. That was all Nella needed. She ran, feet pounding the frost-covered ground, and ducked into the tent. A baby lay in a crate lined with furs, cheeks red from cold. His hair was a soft copper gold. Her knees gave out as she reached him. She scooped him up, held him tight, and felt his warm breath against her neck. Walter, she whispered. Her voice cracked. Walter. Outside there was shouting, a scuffle, then silence. Luther pulled the tent flap open. You all right? She nodded, eyes full of tears. He stepped inside and crouched beside her, watching as she rocked the boy in her arms. You got your voice back, he said, quiet. She looked at him, eyes shining. Then she reached out and touched his cheek. And for the first time she smiled. Walter stirred in her arms, fingers curling against her collar as the early light filtered through the canvas. Nella hadn't slept, though Luther had taken first watch outside the tent after Eli had been hauled off by the logging foreman, who'd promised to hold him until the sheriff from Rawlins arrived. She'd sat cross-legged on the earth floor, back against the pole, cradling her son through the long hours of dark, breathing in the scent of his hair and the faint sourness of old milk on his clothes. When Luther stepped inside, his boots carried the stiffness of cold dawn. He crouched beside the tent's entrance without speaking, hat in his hands. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw the steadiness in her face. Her silence no longer carried the weight of absence, it held choice. "You should eat," he said, voice even. She looked toward the bundle he'd dropped beside her and nodded once. He handed her a small tin of beans wrapped in a cloth. She balanced the boy in her lap and took slow bites. Walter reached a hand toward the spoon, and she let him touch the edge before gently guiding it away. Luther watched the two of them, eyes lingering only a moment before he stood. "We'll need to head back west. Can't stay out here with the snow coming again." Nella set the spoon aside and shifted Walter to her hip. When she rose, she met his gaze without hesitation. "I can take you wherever you think is safest," he added. "You got folks east?" She shook her head. "No one at all?" Her head stayed still this time. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, then maybe you stay on with me a while, till we figure something permanent." She didn't answer with her hands or her face, just looked down at Walter, then back at him. Her eyes softened slightly. Then she stepped forward and brushed a piece of hay from his shoulder. It was answer enough. They left the camp before the full sun broke over the peaks. Walter bundled close to her chest. Luther walked beside the wagon most of the day, one hand on the reins, the other swinging loose at his side. The trail was rutted and hard, and the wind kept its teeth tucked just beneath the surface. Nella sat wrapped in the same shawl, Walter nodding in and out of sleep against her. When they stopped to rest the horse, Nella took Walter to a spot beneath a pine tree and laid him down between her knees. She pulled the wool shawl over him and brushed her finger along his temple. Her lips moved, soundless, forming syllables only she and the boy knew. A lullaby, maybe, or a prayer. Luther crouched nearby, watching her with the quiet patience of someone who'd spent his life listening for things other men missed. "You ever worked a homestead before?" he asked finally. Her mouth tugged in something close to a smile. She nodded. "Good with a garden?" She tipped her head to one side, fingers still stroking Walter's hair. "Chickens?" That earned him a small puff of breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. He looked toward the horizon. "There's room for a coop behind the barn, and I started fencing off a patch last spring for planting." Didn't get far. She looked at him then, a question in her eyes. "Too much to do alone," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, not from weariness but from something almost companionable. Each mile westward pulled them further from the memory of the tent, of Eli's voice, of the empty cradle. The trail turned familiar again by late afternoon, and when the cabin came into view, Nella's breath caught not in fear, but recognition. He helped her down from the wagon, steadying her as she stepped into the yard. Walter stirred but didn't wake. She walked ahead of him to the porch, then stopped, looking back. "I can fix the roof before winter," Luther said quietly, "and I'll clear that chimney proper this time." She nodded, then reached for his hand. Her fingers curled around his gently, firmly. She didn't let go. That night, after Walter was laid in a basket with wool tucked close around him, Luther lit the lantern and set it low on the table. Nella sat across from him, elbows resting lightly on the wood. Her eyes moved over the room walls she'd once known, now warmed by the presence of someone who stayed. He poured water into a tin cup and slid it across to her. She took it, then touched her throat. Her voice, when it came, was rasped and quiet. "Thank you." He didn't flinch at the sound, just looked at her, long and steady. "You don't owe me that." "I do," she said. Her voice cracked again, unused threads catching on the words. "You stayed." He reached across the table, not rushed, not demanding, just offering. "I ain't going anywhere." She placed her hand in his, and something shifted between them, not sudden, not loud. Just a quiet truth settling into place, like a seed in spring soil. The baby sighed in his sleep. The fire popped once. Outside, The wind moved soft through the pines. And for the first time in a long while, Nella let herself believe in the shape of a future. Luther came in from the barn with the last of the chopped wood slung over one shoulder, his boots shedding thin trails of snow across the floorboards. He paused in the doorway just long enough to catch the scent of something warm and sharp in the air. Onions. Maybe browned slow and steady. Nella stood at the stove, sleeves pushed to the elbows, her hair braided in a thick rope down her back. Walter was in a basket beside the hearth, gurgling softly, one chubby hand batting at the air. She stirred the pot with quiet focus, the lines beneath her eyes softer than they'd been since they'd come back. "I think he's gonna learn to crawl before the month's out," Luther said, setting down the wood beside the hearth. "He's got strong legs on him." Nella dipped the spoon, tasted it, then took a clean cloth from the hook and turned toward the table. She didn't speak, but the way she moved steady, unhurried, carried a kind of calm that hadn't lived in the room before. "You feeling rested at all?" Luther asked, brushing snow from his sleeves. "I can take the next night watch if he fusses." She tilted her head, just slightly, then reached over to adjust the corner of Walter's blanket. When she looked up, her mouth shaped a single word. "Better." He nodded once. "Good." They ate by lantern glow, Walter dozing beside them. The stew was thick with beans and dried meat, and she'd added something from the root cellar he hadn't touched since last season. He didn't ask her how she'd known what to do. Some things didn't need explaining. After supper, she brought out a small bundle wrapped in muslin and opened it on the table. Inside were 3 pieces of pale cloth, edges worn but clean, and a needle threaded already with dark blue thread. "I didn't know you had sewing things," Luther said, watching her smooth the fabric with the flat of her palm. She nodded once, then pointed toward the corner chest, where her satchel now rested. She pulled the needle through with practiced ease, her stitches even and sure. Luther leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely. "You thinkin' to make a shirt?" She glanced up, then back at the cloth. "For him?" he asked. She gave a small shake of her head, then pushed one of the pieces toward him. It was shaped like a square, the corners folded in. "For me?" he asked, brows lifting. She nodded, eyes on the thread. "I ain't had a new kerchief in 4 winters," he said, smiling faintly. "Yours'll be the finest one I've ever had." She didn't smile, not exactly, but her shoulders eased as if the tension had stepped back a pace. Outside, the wind had slowed to a low hush through the trees. Luther stood and checked the latch on the window just in case. When he turned back, Nella was gathering the cloth, folding it with care. "You got a middle name?" he asked as he banked the fire. She looked up, surprised by the question. "Mine's Elias," he said. "Never cared for it." She hesitated, then touched her chest. "Jane, Jane," he repeated. "That suits you." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than before, and then she turned to lift Walter gently, cradling him against her chest. He stirred but didn't wake. "You want me to take him while you get ready for sleep?" Luther asked. She didn't answer with a nod. Instead, she stepped forward and placed the boy into his arms. Walter sighed and curled into Luther's shoulder without protest. "Well now," Luther said softly, "you're heavier than you look." Nella stood near the table, watching. Her hands were still, and there was something in her face, an openness, quiet but certain. Luther rocked Walter in small arcs as he moved closer. "You trust me with him." She met his eyes, and for the first time she didn't look away. "I won't let either of you go hungry," he said, "or cold, or alone." She stepped toward him, close enough for the lantern light to catch the line of her throat, the faint shadow beneath her cheekbone. Her fingers reached up, brushing just above Walter's back, and then touched Luther's wrist. He didn't move, I don't know what comes next, he said, voice low. But I'd like it to be the three of us, if you want that too. She leaned in, her forehead resting for a breath against his shoulder. No words, no nod, just the weight of her presence, willing and unafraid. They stood like that long enough for the fire to settle low and Walter to breathe into sleep again. Later, when Nella lay beneath the quilt and Luther took the rocking chair beside the hearth, the quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something steady, something beginning. The first snow that stayed came 2 weeks later, laying a thin hush over the land. It clung to fence rails and settled in the hollows of the pines behind the cabin. Nella stood at the window in the early light, Walter propped on her hip, both watching flakes drift like ash from a slow-burning sky. Luther was out behind the barn, hammering fresh nails into the gate he'd finished the day before. She could hear the rhythm of it through the walls, steady, spaced, like a heartbeat against the cold. Walter made a soft sound low in his throat, and Nella shifted him higher. His cheeks were warm against her collarbone, his hair damp from sleep. She kissed the top of his head once, then wrapped a shawl around the both of them and stepped outside. The air bit at the edges of her skin, but she didn't mind it. Walter burrowed closer into her chest, his fingers wrapped around the cloth. She rounded the side of the cabin just as Luther straightened from the gate, hammer still in hand. "You're braver than me," he said, brushing snow from his gloves. "I figured you'd keep to the stove till spring." Nella tilted her head toward the gate. "Finished this morning," he said. "Just needs oil on the hinge. I'll do that after breakfast." She glanced at the pasture beyond, where the snow had begun to smooth out the furrows from the last plowing. Then she looked back at him and raised her brows. "Thinking of planting?" he asked. She nodded. "Well," he said, "I've got seed potatoes from last season, and the ground'll want tilling come March. We can plan it out together." Walter stirred again, mouth working against her coat. Nella bounced him gently, then looked toward the barn. "I fed the mare already," Luther said. "But if you want to check her, I'll hold the boy." She hesitated, then passed the baby into his arms. Luther settled him easily, resting one big hand across his back as Walter blinked up at him. "Looks like you're getting heavier," he said. "Ain't fair to your ma. You keep growing like this." Nella opened the barn door and disappeared inside. Luther shifted his weight, adjusting the boy. "You want a dog, little man? Might be we can find one. Something with long ears and no sense." Walter grabbed a fistful of Luther's collar and gurgled. When Nella returned, she held a small wooden box in one hand, wrapped in a bit of burlap. She set it on the porch and unwrapped it slowly. Inside were dried herbs, folded cloth, and a small tin of beeswax. Luther looked down at it. "What's all this?" She pointed to the cloth, then to the baby's cheeks, which had begun to redden with the cold. "You made it?" he asked. She nodded once. "Well, that'll save us a trip to town, and probably work better, too." She opened the tin and dipped 2 fingers into the wax. After taking Walter back, she rubbed a thin layer across his cheeks and the tip of his nose. The baby blinked, then sighed. Luther watched her hands move. "You ever think about setting up a table at the spring fair? Folks pay decent for salves that don't burn." She gazed up at him, startled. "Could build you a bench," he said. "Something near the window where the light's good." She looked down at the box in her lap. After a long moment, she nodded. That evening, while Walter slept curled at the foot of the bed in his basket, Nella sat cross-legged on the floor cutting cloth strips. Luther was at the table, shaping a short length of pine into something smooth and square. "You ever have brothers?" he asked, not looking up. She shook her head. "I had 2, he said. "One got himself killed trying to break a Mustang too early. Other joined the cavalry and never came back." Nella set down her cloth, her eyes steady on his face. Pa died of a fever when I was 16. Ma didn't last long after that. I took the land before it got claimed by someone else. He ran the plane over the wood again, slow and careful. You don't have to tell me anything, he added. But if there's someone out there looking for you, I'd want to know. She reached for the pencil near the oil lamp and scribbled on the edge of a paper scrap. Then she turned it toward him. They think I died. Luther's brow furrowed. You want to keep it that way? She paused, then nodded. He said nothing more, just set down the plane and reached across the table. She met him halfway, her fingers curling around his. You mean to stay? He asked, voice quiet. She didn't answer right away. Then, without looking down, she reached across and touched the back of his hand again. Her thumb moved once across his knuckles. That night, she didn't go to the bed right away. After Walter was settled, she sat beside Luther at the hearth, a quilt around her shoulders. He didn't crowd her with questions, just offered her the warmth of the fire and the stillness of the hour. When her head tipped slowly onto his shoulder, he didn't move. He just stayed. And outside, the snow kept falling, soft and sure, covering the broken places in a clean, quiet hush. In early March, the ground began to soften, and with it, the rhythm of the house changed. Luther rose earlier, the smell of damp earth pulling him toward the pasture, where he worked the frozen soil loose with slow, careful turns of the spade. Nella began planting herbs in clay pots by the window. The room filled with the scent of thyme and chamomile, and Walter had begun crawling unevenly, one knee always dragging a little behind the other. Late one afternoon, Nella stood in the doorway with a shallow basin in her arms. The wind carried the faintest trace of sun-warmed pine, and the clouds had begun to stretch thin across the sky. Walter sat on a blanket nearby, preoccupied with a strip of leather Luther had cut for him. She stepped into the yard and poured the last of the water into the trough. Behind her, Luther walked up with a length of fence wire coiled over one shoulder. I could use your eyes on something, he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him behind the barn. He pointed toward a crooked beam where the fence met the slope of the hill. I tried to brace it, but the ground's giving under the post. If we adjust it left, it might hold through rain. Nella crouched, pressed her palm against the soil, then stood and pointed higher up the slope. You think just past the root? He asked. She nodded. He handed her one end of the wire and took the other, their movements practiced now, quiet and coordinated. When the post was reset, she held it steady as he drove the spike into place. Couldn't have done that on my own, he said once they stepped back. Nella brushed a curl from her temple, then pointed toward the pasture. I'll get the rest of the slats mended by next week. Then we can start turning the soil for planting. She tapped her fingers twice against her palm, then pointed to herself and then the barn. You want to work the rows? He asked. She nodded once. You think about what you'd like to plant? She used the tip of her finger to draw a small shape in the air. A circle, then a line through it. Cabbage. She smiled, the expression small but sure. That night, as the fire settled low, Luther pulled a folded scrap of paper from the shelf above the hearth and handed it to her. It's from the circuit judge. I sent to him a few weeks back, after talking to the sheriff in Rawlins. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was stiff, formal. Her eyes moved across the lines, then stopped. She looked up at him. I know you didn't ask, he said, but I figured if you're to raise Walter here, it'd help to have it in writing. She looked back down at the paper. Her name was there, full and clear, followed by a line that read, Legal custodial and maternal care confirmed. She ran her thumb over the words, then folded it again and set it down with care. When she looked at him, her eyes were shining. I wanted you to have a name again, he said. one that couldn't be taken. She crossed the room, slow and unhurried, and placed her hand against his chest. "My name is Nella," she whispered. He covered her hand with his own. "I know." She leaned up, and he met her halfway, his mouth brushing hers with the kind of quiet certainty that didn't need to prove itself. Her fingers curled behind his neck, not pulling him close so much as anchoring herself there. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I want to stay," she said. His answer was a breath against her skin. "Then stay." He helped her into bed beneath the quilt. Walter nestled in his basket nearby. The lamp was turned low, the room still. She reached for his hand beneath the covers. Their fingers laced together, warm and solid. Spring came in full the next week. The pasture turned dark with growth, and seedlings lined the windowsill like small promises. Walter took his first steps in the back room, arms out and head cocked, as if listening to something only he could hear. They married in April, with 2 neighbors for witnesses and a white ribbon in Nella's hair. She wore a dress sewn from muslin she'd salvaged from the bottom of her chest, and Luther shaved for the first time since winter. There was no preacher, just a folded slip of paper and the judge's letter. But when he took her hand and said, "You're mine if you'll have me," she said, "I already am." And it was enough. By midsummer, the cabbages grew fat and round in the earth, and Walter's legs carried him across the yard with more determination than balance. Luther built her a table near the south window, where she mixed wax and oils in small jars. Folks from town came by once a month, and she sold her salves wrapped in twine, her name etched on each label. At night, they sat on the porch with their knees touching, the baby asleep inside, and the scent of sage rising from the hills. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. They had learned each other's silences. And in the quiet, they built a life that fit them both, shaped not by the past, but by each hand laid steady on the next.